this evening we're going to talk about architecture, which I think, and I think most people think, is a notable strength of Japan. And so we have a Japanese and a British architect to talk about, I don't know, philosophy of architecture. So Tsuyoshi Tane, who is based in Paris, is working on projects all over the world. I think one of the ones we'll almost certainly be talking about is his Estonian National Museum, which, as I was understanding, sort of dominated your life for about 10 years and was completed 3 years ago. And another of his high-profile projects, which of course isn't being built, is your proposal for the Kofun Stadium for the Tokyo Olympics, which was one of the finalists in that competition. And then our other speaker is Matt Ball, who is an associate director at David Chipperfield Architects. And obviously I'm sure many of you are very familiar with David Chipperfield Architects. They also are working on projects internationally, and one that is of particular interest to us at the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, of course, is the Inagawa Cemetery chapel and visitor centre, which was in Japan. But I won't say any more than that. At this point I'll leave our two speakers to speak for themselves. So over to you, Tsuyoshi.
Good evening. Thank you, Tane, for sort of wonderful insight into your work. No pressure. So, actually, I think it is quite difficult to talk about architecture. In a sense, you can only really experience architecture. Of course, architectural culture exists, and here we all are taking part in that, having this discussion. I think we can describe spaces and our experiences of architecture. And as architects, designers, we can also tell stories about our process, how we do it. And I think we can't really avoid that the design process can be quite messy. I mean, as many of you here will know, it's not necessarily a straight line. And in fact, presentations are often sort of present this linear, logical approach as a series of consequential decisions from A to B, as it were. And I think what was interesting about your talk, Tane, was how you tried to reveal this sort of complex layering of thoughts and sort of impulses and research that informs your work, and how you sort of navigate your way through that in a way to give meaning to the buildings you make. So the more I thought about my talk, and obviously what is possible within limited time, the more I wanted to go sort of straight to the basic or essential questions of what is the project about, why is it like it is, and what does it try to do, and to reflect on some of our ambitions as an office, which underlie these questions, and in a sense of find meaning. I'm going to talk about two projects, very different projects, based on my own experience of having worked on them. One is the RA here in London, the Royal Academy, and the other is the Inagawa Cemetery in Japan. I guess you might tell which is which. And I'd also like to acknowledge Tane's theme of the archaeology of the future, and so give you my own take on the role of trying to sort of invoke memory into the design process, as it were. And of course the choice of both of these projects in that sense is no accident. Can I use this? Or? Yeah, okay. So the Royal Academy, founded in 1768, it's one of the oldest, is the oldest art institution in Britain. It's sat on its site in Piccadilly since 1868. And in 1997 it purchased a building at the back, 6 Burlington Gardens, which was originally built by James Penn at the University of London, so not as a museum. In physical terms, essentially you've got three bits. You've got the bit to the south, to the front, off Piccadilly. You go in through the courtyard, probably many of you know it, and into the Burlington House, which is the sort of the main front door, the main galleries. After that, you've got the schools arranged along the sort of famous Cass corridor. So it's a long linear layout, and they have a little courtyard. And then, sorry about that. The building at the back is the one I mentioned, is the Pennethorne 6 Burlington Gardens, which fronts onto the street, Hyogo Street, to the north. So that's the Cass corridor. That the school is the sort of spine of the schools, and that's a sort of early photograph of the Burlington Gardens building, so the building to the back, as it were. And our task as the architects was twofold. Firstly, it was a master planning exercise of how to connect up the two buildings, Burlington House at the front, Burlington Gardens at the back, and make a sort of more integrated campus of spaces. Therein then, it was to do with how to develop the program within Burlington Gardens. As I said, it was not designed as an art gallery originally, so how to sort of take the physical framework that existed and turn that into a series of slightly harder working spaces that would, bolster the art offer of the Royal Academy. Our general approach sought to sort of respect the history and the architectural, physical nature of the existing buildings. We created a master plan essentially, ultimately, as a series of punctual interventions. So it was not conceived as a sort of giant overarching framework applied onto the sort of existing buildings. It was more a series of discrete moments that plugged in. And I didn't have another image of that, but I found this one, which also reflected the other one of the other interesting sort of complexities, if you like, and that was the client was not sort of a single person. It was this diverse group of people, a body, all with their own opinions and sort of conflicting needs. So life wasn't easy. The big sort of infrastructural move, in a master planning sense, was to essentially connect up the front and the rear building by just going straight through the schools, which of course caused certain anxieties at the time during the plan. Actually, I should just say that there were previous schemes before David Chipperfield Architects were appointed by other architects, Hopkins, Collins, Simpson Wilson, that tried to also grapple with this task of trying to connect up these two buildings, either by going over the top or going around the sides. But our approach was to, as I say, just go straight through. And the strategy that we sort of essentially put down was to reappropriate, to reuse what was sort of services back of house corridor off the main entrance from Burlington House, to go through that and then to create a sort of bridge that would get you up over into a new link gallery space, we called it, and then into Burlington Gardens. And this, as I said, would be a sort of public route right through the institution. This is the service corridor as we found it, and this is what it became. And I think the point to note here is that there was a potential in that original space to be more than just pure circulation. The proportions of it, the scale and the role that we sort of gave it in becoming this public route. And therefore, as you can see, it became a sort of another type of gallery space, sculptures and I think that's a kind of concern that permeates through all our work in museums, and we are quite involved in museums. And and it's this desire, and it's a bit like what Tane said earlier, to sort of integrate circulation or movement with a kind of experience of seeing, appreciating art. And I guess in a more general sense, it's a sort of ambition of how can something be more and do more than what it simply has to do. This little section talks about the bridge, and of course here we had a kind of historic space that we just sort of cleaned up, essentially. But while there was no kind of precedent, no rules, so to speak, the question was how to sort of invent the architecture that filled in these gaps. And I think what we tried to do was avoid any overt sort of formal devices or kind of aesthetic conceits, and just try to sort of devise an architecture based strictly on what it had to do. I mean, these are a few photos of models, on the one hand showing how we work as an office, but also showing this sort of iterative process of trying to find the form. And essentially then, you know, we knew that it had to contain a staircase, a lift, perhaps a window to sort of get a bit of light in, and it ought to span this space in the most sort of straightforward, uncomplicated way. And so that's what we got, and it, you know, it has its own sort of expression apart, you know, distinct from the historic fabric. And I guess there's the other thing that did it, I don't have a plan, I don't think, it had to sort of realign two axes, the axes from Burlington House and the axes from Burlington Gardens, and sort of negotiate this. So that essentially what I'm trying to say is that the resultant form that came out was really a sort of putting together of these different issues in the most simple way we could. And I think, you know, standing back, you could say, you know, the bridge obviously does the job of connecting the two buildings, but I think, and in light of the sort of anxiety from the schools about the kind of potential divisive nature of this, it actually opened up the schools. It sort of gave them a front door, and more than that, I think it sort of, you know, created this public route through a building, and it sort of opened up and made more permeable the institution that they are in. Burlington Gardens then, which is the block to the rear, when we sort of went into there, you know, it's this building that had accrued layers of kind of careless intervention over the last 150 years, and had sort of gone through different uses from the university and so on. You know, there were some bits that were intact, and it was just sort of a case of fabric that had been overpainted, and then there were other bits that had just been wholesale sort of damaged or displaced, and in fact quite a lot of destruction of original fabric. So a large part of our work was actually sort of digging down, you know, doing our research and trying to uncover, you know, the original drawings by Pennethorne, and pulling together this sort of documentary evidence, whether it be in drawings or photographs. And I must say, in this process, we were supported by Julian Harrop, architects who are sort of expert conservation architects. And of course, we had to sort of communicate what we found to a sort of a larger team of consultants, and also the client, obviously, and try and draw out all the different issues that that the kind of evidence of the historic fabric and the sort of status quo presented against the needs of the you know, what would go in there. And I think what became evident throughout this process, throughout this dialogue, was the idea that the sort of the memory of the physical matter that was there even if it was just contained in documents like drawings or photographs, actually became this sort of quite valuable currency by which to sort of exchange ideas with people and the various stakeholders. So a sort of common language almost, which people could understand and empathise with. You know, we all generally like historic buildings. Just looking at one example of one of our interventions then, the lecture theatre was a space that had been completely carved up. The original lecture theatre that was there, rather charming, in this sort of triple height space with, you know, sort of clerestory, high level lighting, looked really great. But of course what we found was something completely different. I mean, this photo is actually halfway through us sort of stripping back what was there, but the whole space had essentially been cut into two. Our proposals then sought to kind of re-establish the qualities that that everyone seemed to love about the original design. And you know, of course, it would be slightly weird to try and do an exact replica of this, and especially, you know, as architects, we have to acknowledge and build to certain, you know, codes and regulations. But nonetheless, I think the sort of the qualities of, you know, the light and the generosity of space, and the sort of form of the amphitheatre are ones that we try to sort of bring out in our contemporary reinstatement. I mean, here's another drawing by Penethorne showing the space, and actually shows a bit the sort of grandeur and light more so, and actually that there was this whole sort of different material expression on the interior as well. It wasn't a sort of white plastidifier. So, you know, again, we went through a sort of series of design exploration process, a series of models, exploring, you know, what would be the best fit to all the new needs and our desire to sort of maintain a certain continuity. And I mean, it became pretty clear, despite, you know, advice from some parts, sound engineers, that, you know, the horseshoe, the semicircular form, seems to have a sort of very democratic quality, and also, you know, gave a sort of certain intimacy to the space, so everyone can always see the audience can always relate to the speaker. And yeah, I mean, here's just a photo of the thing that's finished, showing that we opened up the lights, and we, you know, brought the space back to a sort of double height space. Yes, and I think the sort of interesting point is that, you know, sort of well-purposed spaces, you know, at whatever point they're built, can ultimately sort of endure, and despite what gets thrown at it. And I think that's something, a kind of value that we try and hold on to when we're making buildings. The second project then, Inagawa, actually I see Patrick is in the room, a former colleague who also worked on the project, so he might pick me up if I go wrong somewhere. But this doesn't show it very well, but essentially it's not so far from Kyoto, and a couple of hours on train from Tokyo, on fast train. And at the start of the project, the client sent us, it doesn't come out very clearly, but this sort of beautiful map showing the topography and all the contours, and a series of sort of 10 by 8 photographic prints, which really showed this just incredible site. It was also taken, as you can see, during the cherry blossom season, so it was obviously a sort of extremely exciting opportunity. And our brief was essentially to replace an existing building, the shed you see here on the left, which you know, was sort of deeply mundane, and contained spaces the sort of facilities that allowed the cemetery to sort of go about its daily business. So it had you know, a little cafe for visitors, obviously toilets, sort of administrative part, and sort of a place to buy flowers. And what the client sort of asked is, apart from sort of upgrade all of this, was to create a space, a chapel, which ultimately, you know, the sort of the function of this building is about memory, a different type of memory. So it's you know, memorial and remembering the lives of sort of loved ones. So he wanted to create a special space that would have a slightly more spiritual atmosphere, but would be non-denominational. So the program, in a sense, was relatively simple, and so one of the main kind of priorities was a kind of concern for how could the building become a meaningful addition to the context, not just as a form, but also in terms of what it sort of gave back to the village. And we were keen that, oh, you don't see that? Oh. We were keen that you know, it should sort of integrate as a sort of building in a very natural way into the environment. Either, I mean, we looked at different sort of massing models. So, you know, one approach was to really try and embed the thing into this topography, and another, and you know, these are just examples that we had to hand, but was to almost say, you know, can it sit a bit more delicately on, you know, above the surface of the terrain? And I think, you know, the kind of clue to the final project came from observing you know, the terraces that make up the cemetery, and sort of observing that, you know, they're almost like sort of, you know, geometric fingerprints of this topography, if you will. As I said, the contours on the original map didn't really show up, but you know, you get these sort of windy lines, and then they go straight, and then they kind of step when they have to deal with, you know, curves or a kind of a terrain that's below. And so this, you know, was pretty powerful inspiration to us, and we realised we could sort of, you know, treat the building more as an extension of the landscape as opposed to a sort of object placed upon it. So here, I mean, just a few kind of early sketches. The other important thing, you know, as a part of the landscape, is that we realised the building could be a singular sort of thing, you know, and what we sought to do was, you know, to the outside, kind of respond to this. There was a road and a little river running down here, and then this was this is the base of the staircase that sort of, as you saw from the image, sort of went in a very axial, monumental way straight up the cemetery. So could it have this sort of, you know, stepping form on the outside, and then contain a kind of pure form in the middle, which would be a garden. You know, the other move we made is, so we sort of, again, another iteration of the plan, trying to find its final shape, as it were. And then the other idea was to, you know, having put everything, as it were, under one roof within one building, can we take that roof and sort of tilt it up so it relates to the hill? You know, this actually brought about another hierarchy, another dynamic to the plan, because suddenly then you had sort of taller spaces, which became the chapel, and sort of slightly more intimate spaces to the road, which were the, you know, administrative or the kind of memorial rooms. And then, well, this is then the sort of final model, and you see how, you know, we're really trying to get the building to kind of lock into the site, and you know, become this sort of embedded part of the environment. As I said, at the centre of the project, the sort of heart of the project, if you will, is a garden, which is a public garden. as a place of arrival, and it sort of mediates between the outer world of the village and everything, and then this sort of inner, slightly more special world of the cemetery. So it was a sort of decompression space, in a way. And then, the organisation, the program around it became a series of a string of rooms, sort of lined up, connected by a kind of walkway. So sort of like the idea of a cloister. And of course, the garden would sort of bring light and sort of a view into each of these rooms. And we made this sort of big model, and we started to enjoy how this definition of the garden, this sort of edge, was actually could be quite soft and quite playful. So different rooms, looked onto it in different ways. This is showing the memorial rooms, which had these sort of tall, punctual windows, which could be, and the space could be divided down by these kind of curtains, which were Japanese paper curtains, into sort of smaller rooms. But by contrast, the cafe almost became this sort of glass box, this kind of vitrine placed into the garden, and the very sort of walls of the cafe, got peeled back from this kind of concrete shell that we made. And then the chapel would be, as I said, the sort of taller space, but we wanted it to have this kind of more raw character. We said it would be in concrete, and it obviously had, we wanted to create this sort of even more intense relationship with nature, and also sort of give it a sort of higher intimacy than the other functions. So we created, in a sense, a second garden, a walled garden, and the walls of the chapel sort of extended out to define this little garden, which was on either side of the space. And then higher up, we let light kind of reflect in the other direction. So it was this attempt, I suppose, to sort of knit a kind of space and interior together with light and nature and landscape into a kind of spiritual unity. I'm going slightly back here, actually. And let's sort of say that, even at the very early stages of developing the kind of the massing and the kind of programmatic organisation of the project, we were also obviously concerned with the kind of atmosphere of, what this place wanted to be, how did it want to feel. And I suppose we were trying to interpret, what the project was about beyond a sort of solution to the program, but more as a sort of sense of place. And these are photos from a kind of earlier scheme, but nonetheless they convey this concern with light and the way light enters the building, and by extension the sort of the material quality of the building. This, Patrick will remember, quite a fun process. Thinking about the material and how this building was made and how it would let light in and what sort of atmosphere that would produce, I suppose became a kind of a concern, in a sense what I'm trying to say is throughout the project. I skip on here to a sort of morning site meeting, and the point is that we're architects in London and doing a building in Japan, and we had to engage with a local architect and local contractor, and building, of course, is a kind of engaged act. We can't do it alone. And here we are building in Japan, which is a country, as many of you will know, which is quite accustomed to earthquakes, and I would have thought, has a building culture that has developed very much out of this, how to deal with this. And so the kind of approach to building a strong concrete building is well practiced there, and I must say that the team brought incredible expertise to the project. We just had to check drawings, and the local architect really understood our ambitions, and then the contractor did this incredible building. But there was another reason why we thought about doing the building in concrete as well, and that was to do with an idea of permanence. And of course in this place where, let's say that the human life, or the temporality of human life, is sort of acknowledged and memorialized, then it was our ambition that our building could really become a kind of backdrop for all of that to happen, a sort of background, and become part of the context as opposed to the subject of what's going on. So that sort of accounts, in a sense, for the concrete as well. And just standing back and thinking about what the project became as a place, this is the sort of entrance, and you can sort of see the village in the background. We already tried to create this little public gesture of a kind of little square almost with a fountain as an entrance, a sort of threshold in through this gateway. And of course the garden is a public space, so despite the fact that activities go on in private in this place, there was this sort of offering, this giving back to society, if you will. And one of the very nice things as well about the project was the way the sort of material of the building behaves in different weathers and against different seasons. So when it rains, the concrete becomes sort of dark and almost mirror-like, and then in the sun, it seems to sort of these porous concrete walls almost sort of absorb the shadows of the plants that dance across the surface. So there's a very nice dialogue between this kind of constant, this rock, if you like, and then this sort of ever-changing nature that flow through it. And of course, the building was about sort of rituals and the process of memorial, etc. But as I say, it's a building that people kind of enjoy, just walk through and maybe sort of hang out a little bit. And the garden, I think, became this sort of very nice amenity to the project. And what I quite like about this image is it sort of became the focus as well. So it's not all about our big shiny building, it's about just framing this sort of public gesture. And the chapel, I mean, I saw the model photo before, but the kind of the way the light comes in and off different surfaces, and then this sort of more intimate relation with the garden, created, I guess, a space that, if it's not unusual, then has a sort of certain spiritual atmosphere. And just sort of standing back then, if we go back to the initial task, then clearly we sort of gave the client what he wanted, but I think the sort of great success of the project is that we, this building really found its place. It really kind of locked into its environment and just became another part of the landscape. So to summarise then, we looked fairly briefly at two very different projects, each with different conditions and sites. different briefs, and each with their own kind of memories, if you like. You know, it goes without saying that we obviously try to sort of solve the brief and answer the kind of client's concerns, but I think we also try to go beyond just making a kind of solution to the problem. You know, both projects sort of engage in an acute relation with their environment. You know, both make a kind of public gesture, whether it's the sort of the bridge and the link through the RA, or the kind of garden at the heart of Inagawa. And both kind of concern themselves with a sort of physical idea of, or actually with the idea of the plan as a sort of, you know, society of rooms. You know, it's not, we're trying to create character and atmosphere, and, you know, not in a way create a space which is infinite and, you know, like how data behaves, but trying to create a frame, you know, trying to create place. And I think, you know, these are kind of values which, you know, common values to our practice, which kind of, you know, thread through all our work. And they're about prioritizing sort of purpose over effect and meaning over image. And, you know, you could simply call that sort of added value if you like, but I think in a deeper sense is an attempt to, you know, hold on to our credibility as architects, as sort of designers or agents in the development of, you know, cities and places. And I think, you know, in this sort of mad world of images and novelty, you know, that's a kind of a really fundamental role for us, and our responsibility as architects. Thank you.